She had been invisible for years, just another face in the crowd, doing her job without complaint. No one noticed the exhaustion in her eyes, the weight she carried in silence, especially not him, the powerful CEO who walked past her every day without a second glance. But behind that quiet facade was a secret so devastating, it had the power to turn his entire world upside down. What happens when the person you underestimate the most holds the key to your downfall? The moment he discovers her truth, everything he thought he knew about success, power, and control begins to crumble. And in that shattering realization, he's forced to face a choice that could change everything for both of them. This is a story about the hidden struggles we never see, and the explosive moment when one woman's quiet strength collides with a man's arrogance. When the truth is finally revealed, nothing will ever be the same. The bustling heart of New York City pulsed with its usual frenetic energy, but within the towering glass edifice of Apex Innovations, a storm was brewing. Sarah Thompson, her weathered hands clutching a crumpled piece of paper, stood before the imposing mahogany doors of CEO Jonathan Blackwell's office. Her heart raced, each beat a painful reminder of the weight she carried. With trembling fingers, she smoothed the wrinkles of her decade-old blouse, a stark contrast to the sleek designer suits that glided past her in the hallway. Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself for what lay ahead. She had to do this. For Tommy. As she pushed open the heavy door, the scent of leather and success assaulted her senses. Jonathan Blackwell, impeccably dressed in a tailored Armani suit, barely glanced up from his computer screen. His steely gray eyes, cold as a Manhattan winter, finally flickered towards her with undisguised annoyance. "Yes," he said, his voice clipped and impatient. "What is it now, Sarah? Susan?" "It's Sarah, sir," she replied softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah Thompson from accounting." Jonathan's lip curled slightly, as if even saying her name left a bad taste in his mouth. "Right, well, make it quick. I have a board meeting in 10 minutes. Sarah's fingers tightened around the paper in her hand, a doctor's note that might as well have been her son's death warrant. She took a shaky breath and began, "Mr. Blackwell, I need to request some time off. My son, Tommy, he's..." "Time off?" Jonathan interrupted, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. "We're in the middle of our biggest quarter yet, and you want time off?" Sarah felt her throat constrict, but she pressed on. "Please, sir. Tommy's condition has worsened. The doctors say..." "Ms. Thompson," Jonathan said, standing up and buttoning his jacket in one fluid motion. "Do you know how many single parents work for this company? How many people have sick relatives, ailing parents, or personal issues?" Sarah's eyes stung with unshed tears. "I understand, sir, but..." "No, I don't think you do," Jonathan continued, his voice dripping with disdain. "This company doesn't run on sob stories and excuses. It runs on dedication, hard work, and sacrifice. If you can't handle that, well..." He gestured dismissively towards the door. "I'm sure we can find someone who can." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She staggered slightly, her vision blurring as she fought to maintain her composure. In that moment, she wanted nothing more than to scream, to make him understand the agony that tore at her heart every single day. But she couldn't. She needed this job. Tommy needed this job. I understand, Mr. Blackwell," she managed to choke out. "I'm sorry for wasting your time." As she turned to leave, her trembling hands dropping the doctor's note, Jonathan's voice stopped her cold. "Oh, and Sarah, next time schedule an appointment. I'm not running a charity here." The door closed behind her with a soft click, but to Sarah it might as well have been a gunshot. She stumbled to the nearest restroom, locking herself in a stall before the tears finally came. They streamed down her face, hot and angry, as she muffled her sobs with a fist pressed against her mouth. How could she tell Tommy? How could she look into those big brown eyes so full of trust and hope and tell him that Mommy couldn't be there for his treatments? The thought alone was enough to make her physically ill. As Sarah fought to regain her composure, she didn't notice the curious glances from her coworkers or the whispers that followed her. She was too lost in her own private hell, a world where every moment was a battle between hope and despair. Meanwhile, back in his office, Jonathan Blackwell straightened his tie and prepared for his board meeting. He glanced at the crumpled paper on the floor, the one Sarah had dropped. but didn't bother to pick it up. Why should he care about the troubles of some low-level employee? He had an empire to run after all. But as he strode out of his office, a strange feeling niggled at the back of his mind. Something about the look in Sarah's eyes, the desperation in her voice, had struck a chord he thought long since silenced. He shook his head, banishing the thought. Empathy was a luxury he couldn't afford, not in his position. Little did Jonathan know that this seemingly insignificant interaction would be the first domino to fall in a series of events that would shake the very foundation of his carefully constructed world. The secrets hidden behind Sarah's pleading eyes and the consequences of his callous dismissal would soon come crashing down, forcing him to confront the true cost of success and the power of compassion. As the sun began to set over the New York skyline, casting long shadows across the city, Sarah Thompson boarded a crowded subway, her heart heavy with the weight of an impossible choice. And high above in his penthouse office, Jonathan Blackwell raised a glass of scotch to another successful day, blissfully unaware that his world was about to be turned upside down. The stage was set, the players in place, and as night fell on the city that never sleeps, fate began to weave a tapestry of redemption, sacrifice, and unexpected connection that would change both their lives forever. The harsh fluorescent lights of the subway flickered, casting an eerie glow on Sarah Thompson's tear-stained face. It was well past 10 p.m., and the train car swayed with the familiar rhythm of late-night New York City transit. Sarah clutched her worn leather purse, her knuckles white with exhaustion and worry. As the automated voice announced her stop, Sarah stumbled out onto the platform, her body moving on autopilot. The hospital loomed ahead, its imposing structure a beacon of both hope and despair. She'd made this journey countless times, but tonight, the weight of Jonathan Blackwell's dismissal made each step feel like wading through quicksand. The antiseptic smell hit her as soon as she entered the pediatric ward. Nurses in colorful scrubs offered sympathetic smiles as she passed. They knew her well here, too well. Sarah paused outside room 305, taking a deep breath to compose herself. She couldn't let Tommy see her pain. "Hey, sweetie," she said softly, pushing open the door. "Mommy's here." Tommy's small form was dwarfed by the hospital bed, tubes and wires snaking around him like some cruel medical cocoon. His bald head gleamed in the dim light, a stark reminder of the aggressive chemotherapy ravaging his young body. But when he opened his eyes, they sparkled with a resilience that never failed to take Sarah's breath away. "Mom!" Tommy's voice was weak but filled with joy. "You made it!" Sarah's heart clenched. She'd promised to be here hours ago to read him his favorite story before bed. Another promise broken, another sacrifice at the altar of survival. "Of course I did, buddy," she said, forcing a smile as she settled into the chair beside his bed. "How was your day? Did you beat Nurse Jenny at Go Fish again?" Tommy launched into an animated recount of his day, his enthusiasm belying the gravity of his condition. Sarah listened intently, hanging on to every word, every precious moment with her son. As he spoke, she gently stroked his hand, careful to avoid the IV lines. "And then Dr. Martinez said if my numbers look good tomorrow, maybe I can go outside to the garden." Tommy finished, his eyes shining with excitement. Sarah's smile faltered for just a moment. The garden. Such a simple pleasure, yet it might as well have been a trip to Disneyland for how rarely Tommy got to experience it. She pushed down the lump in her throat. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," she managed. "We'll have to make sure you get plenty of rest tonight then." As if on cue, Tommy yawned widely. "Will you stay with me, Mom? Just until I fall asleep?" "Of course, baby," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She reached for the dog-eared copy of Where the Wild Things Are on the nightstand, Tommy's favorite. As she read, her mind wandered to the stack of medical bills waiting at home, to the meager balance in her bank account, to Jonathan Blackwell's cold, dismissive gaze. How much longer could she keep this up? The late nights, the missed meals, the constant gnawing fear that one missed day of work could mean the difference between life and death for her son. Tommy's breathing eventually evened out, his small chest rising and falling in the rhythm of sleep. Sarah closed the book gently, leaning forward to place a soft kiss on his forehead. "I love you more than all the stars in the sky," she whispered, their nightly ritual. As she gathered her things to leave, a soft knock at the door startled her. Dr. Martinez entered, his kind eyes crinkling with concern as he took in Sarah's exhausted appearance. "Miss Thompson," he said quietly, "do you have a moment?" Sarah's heart rate spiked. In her experience, nothing good ever followed those words in a hospital. "Of course, Dr. Martinez," she replied, following him into the hallway. The doctor's expression was grave as he spoke. "I've been reviewing Tommy's latest test results. The current treatment, it's not having the effect we hoped for." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Sarah gripped the wall for support, her knees threatening to buckle. What are you saying?" she whispered. Dr. Martinez placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "There's a new trial treatment that shows promise for cases like Tommy's. It's experimental, but the early results are encouraging." A flicker of hope ignited in Sarah's chest. "That's good news, right?" The doctor's hesitation spoke volumes. "The treatment is costly, Miss Thompson, very costly, and I'm afraid it's not covered by your current insurance plan." And just like that, the hope was extinguished, replaced by a familiar, crushing despair. Sarah closed her eyes, fighting back tears. "How much?" she asked, her voice barely audible. When Dr. Martinez named the figure, Sarah felt the room spin. It was more money than she'd ever seen in her life, let alone possessed. I'll find a way," she said, more to herself than to the doctor. "I have to." As she left the hospital that night, the cool air hit her face like a slap. Sarah Thompson, invisible to the world, carried the weight of an impossible choice on her shoulders. She thought of Jonathan Blackwell, probably sleeping soundly in his penthouse, oblivious to the struggles of those beneath him. Little did either of them know that their worlds were about to collide in ways neither could have imagined. As Sarah boarded the late-night train home, fate was already setting in motion a chain of events that would shatter illusions, test loyalties, and redefine the very essence of what it means to be human. The city lights blurred outside the train window, a kaleidoscope of indifference to the silent tears that fell from Sarah's eyes. Tomorrow would bring another day of struggle, another battle in her war against time and circumstance. But for now, in the quiet of the near-empty subway car, she allowed herself a moment of vulnerability, her sobs muffled by the rhythmic clatter of the train on its relentless journey through the night. The rhythmic tapping of expensive Italian leather shoes echoed through the empty corridors of Apex Innovations. Jonathan Blackwell, his tailored suit still impeccable despite the late hour, strode purposefully towards his office. The Manhattan skyline glittered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, a testament to the power and influence he wielded. As he approached his office, a flicker of movement caught his eye. The cleaning lady, an older woman whose name he'd never bothered to learn, was just leaving, her cart laden with trash bags and cleaning supplies. "Evening," Jonathan muttered, barely glancing her way as he reached for his door handle. "Good evening, Mr. Blackwell," she replied softly, her eyes downcast. Something in her tone made Jonathan pause. He turned, really looking at her for the first time. Her face was lined with age and worry, her hands rough from years of labor. For a fleeting moment, he saw his own mother in her features, the same weariness, the same quiet dignity. Shaking off the unexpected pang of, was it guilt? Jonathan entered his office, closing the door firmly behind him. He had no time for sentimentality. There were reports to review, strategies to finalize. As he settled into his plush leather chair, his eyes fell on a crumpled piece of paper near the trash can. Frowning, he leaned down to pick it up. It was the note that Sarah woman had dropped earlier. He was about to toss it when a letterhead caught his attention. Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. Curiosity piqued, Jonathan smoothed out the paper. His eyes widened as he read, "Patient, Thomas Thompson, age 8. Diagnosis, acute lymphoblastic leukemia, ALL. Current status, critical requiring immediate intensive treatment. Recommended course of action, enrollment in XR7 trial study." Jonathan's brow furrowed. Thompson. Sarah Thompson. The woman he'd dismissed so callously earlier. This must be about her son. He turned to his computer, fingers flying over the keyboard as he accessed the company's personnel database. Sarah Thompson, accounting department. Single mother, stellar performance reviews, despite numerous unpaid leave requests over the past year. A gnawing feeling began to grow in the pit of his stomach. He'd assumed she was just another employee trying to take advantage, but this was different. As if driven by an unseen force, Jonathan began digging deeper. He pulled up Sarah's file, her medical insurance claims, her salary information. The picture that emerged was one of a woman stretched to her absolute limits, drowning in medical debt while fighting desperately to save her child's life. His eyes fell on a notification in her file. Legal action pending, case X2945B. Intrigued, Jonathan accessed the legal database. What he found made his blood run cold. Case X2945B, Thompson versus PharmaCorp. Plaintiff alleges gross negligence in drug trial AZT-109, resulting in severe complications for minor child. PharmaCorp, one of Apex Innovation's biggest clients, the same company that had just signed a multi-million-dollar deal with them last quarter. Jonathan's mind raced. He remembered the champagne, the congratulatory handshakes, the promises of revolutionary new treatments. Had they known? Had they covered this up? As the pieces began to fall into place, Jonathan felt the carefully constructed pillars of his world begin to tremble. This wasn't just some low-level employee with a sob story. This was a mother fighting against a system that had grievously wronged her child. A system that he, Jonathan Blackwell, was an integral part of. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on climbing the corporate ladder, on chasing that next big deal, that he'd lost sight of the human cost. People like Sarah Thompson were just collateral damage in the relentless pursuit of profit. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his mind reeling. What was he supposed to do with this information? Exposing PharmaCorp could potentially bring down Apex Innovations, costing thousands of jobs, including his own. But staying silent, could he live with himself knowing what he now knew? As the first rays of dawn began to paint the New York sky, Jonathan Blackwell found himself at a crossroads. The man he had been yesterday would have buried this information without a second thought. But now, faced with the stark reality of Sarah's struggle and his own unwitting complicity, he felt the stirrings of something long dormant within him. Conscience. He reached for his phone, his finger hovering over Sarah's contact information. One call could change everything. For her, for him, for the entire company. But as he stared at the screen, another thought struck him. What if this was just the tip of the iceberg? How many other Sarahs were out there fighting battles he'd been too blind or too callous to see? The weight of the decision pressed down on him, heavier than any corporate responsibility he'd ever shouldered. As New York City began to wake around him, Jonathan Blackwell sat motionless, the crumpled doctor's note in one hand, his phone in the other, poised on the precipice of a choice that would alter the course of countless lives, including his own. The mystery had been revealed, but the true test was yet to come. In the harsh light of this new day, Jonathan would have to decide what kind of man he truly was, and what price he was willing to pay for redemption. The New York summer sun beat down mercilessly on the bustling streets below, but inside his climate-controlled office, Jonathan Blackwell felt a chill that no amount of air conditioning could explain. It had been 3 days since he'd discovered Sarah Thompson's secret, and the knowledge weighed on him like a physical presence. He'd barely slept, his nights plagued by vivid dreams of Sarah's son Tommy, hooked up to machines in a sterile hospital room. In his waking hours, every interaction felt hollow, every decision tainted by the gnawing awareness of his own callousness. As he stared unseeing at the skyline, a memory from just last week surfaced unbidden. "Mr. Blackwell, could I possibly leave an hour early today? My son has a..." "Ms. Thompson, this is a workplace, not a daycare center. I suggest you sort out your priorities if you want to keep your job." The recalled exchange made Jonathan wince. How many times had he dismissed her, belittled her struggles without even a moment's consideration? A knock at the door jolted him from his reverie. "Come in," he called, his voice rougher than usual. His assistant, Jessica, entered with a stack of reports. "The quarterly projections, sir, and Mr. Hartley from PharmaCorp called again about the gala next week." PharmaCorp. The name sent a fresh wave of guilt crashing over him. "Thank you, Jessica, that'll be all." As the door closed behind her, Jonathan made a decision. He couldn't go on like this. He needed to talk to Sarah, to To what? Apologize? Offer help? He wasn't sure, but he knew he had to do something. With trembling fingers, he dialed the extension for the accounting department. "This is Blackwell. Send Sarah Thompson to my office immediately." The next 15 minutes felt like an eternity. Jonathan paced his office, rehearsing what he might say, how he could possibly begin to make amends. When a soft knock finally came, he nearly jumped out of his skin. "Come in," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Sarah entered, her face a mask of apprehension. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Blackwell?" Jonathan gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Please sit down, Ms. Thompson." As Sarah lowered herself into the chair, Jonathan couldn't help but notice how tired she looked. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her clothes hung loosely on her frame, as if she'd lost weight recently. "Ms. Thompson, Sarah," he began, then faltered. "How do you tell someone you've invaded their privacy, uncovered their deepest struggles, all because of a carelessly dropped piece of paper?" Sarah's brow furrowed in confusion. "Is there a problem with my work, sir?" No, nothing like that," Jonathan said quickly. He took a deep breath. "Sarah, I know about Tommy." The color drained from Sarah's face. "I don't understand," she whispered. "The note you dropped in my office last week," Jonathan explained, his voice gentle. "I read it and I did some digging." Sarah's eyes widened in shock, then narrowed in anger. "You had no right," she hissed, her hands clenching into fists on her lap. "You're right, I didn't," Jonathan agreed, surprising them both with his candor. "But Sarah, I need you to understand. I had no idea. The severity of your situation, the struggles you've been facing. I was blind, and worse, I was cruel." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. "With all due respect, Mr. Blackwell, you don't know anything about my situation." "Then tell me," Jonathan said softly, "please." For a long moment, Sarah just stared at him, her expression a mix of disbelief and suspicion. Then, like a dam breaking, the words began to pour out. She told him about Tommy's diagnosis 2 years ago, about the rounds of chemo that ravaged his little body. She spoke of sleepless nights in hospital chairs, of maxed-out credit cards and second mortgages. And finally, her voice breaking, she told him about the experimental trial that represented Tommy's last hope, a trial with a price tag far beyond her reach. As she spoke, Jonathan felt each word like a physical blow. How had he been so blind? How had he failed to see the depth of suffering right under his nose? "Sarah, I don't know what to say," he began, but she cut him off. "You don't have to say anything, Mr. Blackwell," she said, her voice suddenly cold. "I don't need your pity. What I needed was understanding, compassion when I asked for time off. What I needed was a fair chance to balance my work and my son's needs. But it's too late for that now, isn't it?" Jonathan flinched at the bitterness in her tone. "It's not too late," he said desperately. "Sarah, I want to help. Whatever you need, time off, financial assistance, the best doctors." "Stop," Sarah said, holding up a hand. "Just stop. Do you think you can just throw money at this and make it all better? That you can ease your conscience with a few grand and some empty promises?" Her words hit Jonathan like a slap. She was right, of course. He couldn't undo years of neglect and dismissal with a single gesture, no matter how grand. "You're right," he said quietly. "I can't change the past, but Sarah, please let me try to make things right. Not just for you, but for Tommy." At the mention of her son's name, Sarah's composure finally cracked. A sob escaped her lips and she buried her face in her hands. Jonathan stood, moving around the desk to kneel beside her chair. "Sarah," he said gently, "I know I have no right to ask for your trust, but please let me help. Not as your boss, not as some rich guy trying to ease his guilt, but as a human being who's finally waking up to what really matters." Sarah looked up, her tear-stained face a mixture of hope and fear. "Why?" she whispered. "Why now?" Jonathan swallowed hard. "Because I've been wrong. So terribly, inexcusably wrong. And because no child should suffer because of corporate greed or executive indifference." Something in his tone made Sarah sit up straighter. "What do you mean?" Jonathan took a deep breath. This was it. The moment of truth. "Sarah, there's something you need to know about PharmaCorp and your son's case." something that could change everything. As he began to speak, laying out the connections he'd uncovered, the corruption he'd glimpsed, Jonathan Blackwell felt the last vestiges of his old self falling away. He didn't know what the future held, for him or for Sarah and Tommy, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Nothing would ever be the same again. The confrontation he dreaded had become a catalyst for change, a spark of hope in the darkness. And as Sarah listened, her eyes growing wide with each revelation, the first fragile tendrils of trust began to form between them, a bridge across the chasm of indifference that had for so long defined their relationship. The sleek, modern boardroom of Apex Innovations hummed with tension. Jonathan Blackwell sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his usual confident demeanor replaced by a grim determination. Around him, the faces of his executive team ranged from confused to concerned. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Jonathan began, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. "What I'm about to share will likely shock you, but I ask that you hear me out completely before reacting." He took a deep breath, thinking back to his conversation with Sarah just days ago. The pain in her eyes, the tremor in her voice as she spoke of Tommy. It all fueled his resolve now. "For the past week, I've been conducting an internal investigation into our partnership with PharmaCorp," he continued. "What I've uncovered is troubling, to say the least." Jonathan clicked a button, and documents began to appear on the large screen behind him. Financial reports, internal memos, clinical trial data, all damning in their implications. "PharmaCorp has been falsifying data in their drug trials," he said, his words falling like hammer blows in the silent room. "Specifically, they've been covering up severe side effects in their AZT-109 trial, the same trial that nearly killed the son of one of our employees." Gasps and murmurs filled the room. Jonathan pressed on, outlining the web of lies and cover-ups he'd uncovered. With each revelation, he could see the shock and disbelief growing on his colleagues' faces. "But sir," interjected CFO Richard Hargrove, "our deal with PharmaCorp and it's worth millions. Are you saying we should jeopardize that based on one employee's situation?" Jonathan fixed Richard with a steely gaze. "I'm saying we have a moral and legal obligation to expose this fraud, regardless of the financial implications. This could ruin us," warned COO Jennifer Lee, her face pale. "The lawsuits alone." "And what about the lives ruined by our silence?" Jonathan countered. "The children like Tommy Thompson fighting for their lives because we prioritized profits over people?" As the reality of the situation sank in, the room erupted into chaos. Voices raised in argument, fingers pointed accusingly, fear and anger palpable in the air. Amidst the tumult, Jonathan's phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. "Tommy's taken a turn for the worse, at the hospital now, please pray for us." The message hit Jonathan like a physical blow. In that moment, the cacophony of the boardroom faded away, replaced by a clarity he'd never experienced before. "Enough!" he roared, silencing the room. All eyes turned to him, startled by the raw emotion in his voice. "Listen to yourselves," he said, his voice quieter now but no less intense. "We're sitting here in our expensive suits, in our cushy offices, debating whether or not to do the right thing. Meanwhile, there are real people out there suffering because of our choices." He stood, pacing the length of the table as he spoke. "I've been complicit in this system for too long, we all have. We've told ourselves that it's just business, that we're not responsible for the consequences of our deals. But we are." Jonathan paused, letting his words sink in. "I'm going public with this information, all of it, and I'm prepared to face whatever consequences come with that decision." The silence that followed was deafening. Then slowly, Amanda Chen from legal raised her hand. "Sir, if we approach this the right way, we might be able to position Apex as whistleblowers. It could mitigate some of the damage." Jonathan nodded, a glimmer of hope rising in his chest. "Thank you, Amanda. I want a full plan on my desk by tomorrow morning. The rest of you, I need everything you have on PharmaCorp. Every email, every memo, every scrap of information. We're going to blow this wide open." As the team began to mobilize, energized by this new sense of purpose, Jonathan slipped out of the boardroom. He made his way to a quiet corner and dialed Sarah's number. "Sarah?" "It's Jonathan. I'm on my way to the hospital now, and I promise you we're going to make this right. For Tommy and for all the others like him." As he hung up and headed for the elevator, Jonathan felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. The road ahead would be difficult, fraught with legal battles and public scrutiny. His career, his reputation, everything he'd worked for, was on the line. But for the first time in years, Jonathan Blackwell knew with absolute certainty that he was doing the right thing. And that knowledge, painful as it was, felt like the first breath of fresh air after a lifetime of suffocation. The truth hurt, yes, but it also set him free. The steady beep of medical monitors filled the air as Jonathan Blackwell stood in the doorway of Tommy Thompson's hospital room. The sight before him made his chest tighten. Sarah, slumped in a chair beside the bed, her hand gently holding her son's. Tommy lay still, his small frame dwarfed by the machines surrounding him. Jonathan hesitated, feeling like an intruder in this intimate moment of suffering. But before he could retreat, Sarah looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. "You came," she said softly, a hint of surprise in her voice. Jonathan nodded, stepping into the room. "How is he?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's gaze returned to Tommy. "Stable for now. But the doctors say—" Her voice broke and she took a shuddering breath. "They say without the experimental treatment, he doesn't have much time left." The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. Jonathan moved closer, placing a tentative hand on her shoulder. "Sarah, Mr. Blackwell," she interrupted, looking up at him with a mixture of desperation and determination. "I know you said you wanted to help, but I need to know, what are you really prepared to do?" The question hit Jonathan like a punch to the gut. In the sterile hospital room, faced with the reality of Tommy's condition, all his grand gestures and promises seemed hollow. "I'm going public with everything I've discovered about PharmaCorp," he said quietly. "The data manipulation, the cover-ups, all of it." Sarah's eyes widened. "But your career, the company—" Jonathan shook his head. "None of that matters now. What matters is making this right, for Tommy and for all the other families affected by PharmaCorp's actions." A tense silence fell between them, broken only by the rhythmic beeping of Tommy's heart monitor. Jonathan could feel the weight of Sarah's scrutiny, could see the wheels turning in her mind as she weighed his words against years of dismissal and indifference. Finally, Sarah spoke. "And what about the treatment Tommy needs? Even if you expose PharmaCorp, it won't change the fact that we can't afford—" "I'll pay for it," Jonathan said without hesitation. "Whatever it costs, however long it takes, I'll make sure Tommy gets the best care possible." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "Why?" she whispered. "After all this time, why now?" Jonathan moved to the window, looking out at the New York skyline. The city he'd once viewed as his personal playground now seemed alien, a maze of glass and steel hiding countless stories of struggle and pain. "Because I've been wrong," he said softly. "So terribly, inexcusably wrong. I've spent my entire career chasing success, thinking that money and power were all that mattered. But standing here, seeing what you and Tommy have been through, I realize now how empty it all was." He turned back to Sarah, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I can't undo the past. I can't take back the times I dismissed you, the moments I prioritized profits over people. But I can choose to do better now. I can choose to use whatever influence and resources I have left to make a real difference." Sarah studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then slowly she nodded. "Okay," she said. "I believe you." A wave of relief washed over Jonathan, but it was quickly tempered by the gravity of what lay ahead. "Sarah, you should know. Once I go public with this information, things are going to get complicated. There will be investigations, maybe even criminal charges. The media attention alone could be overwhelming." "I understand," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "But if it means saving Tommy and preventing this from happening to other families, it's worth it." As if on cue, Tommy stirred in his sleep, a small whimper escaping his lips. Sarah was instantly at his side, smoothing his forehead and murmuring soft reassurances. Watching them, Jonathan felt a fierce resolve settle over him. This was it, the moment that would define the rest of his life. He could walk away now, bury the evidence, and salvage what was left of his career and reputation. Or he could take a stand, knowing full well the storm that would follow. With a deep breath, Jonathan made his choice. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he never thought he'd use. "This is Jonathan Blackwell," he said when the line connected. "I need to speak with the Attorney General immediately. It's about PharmaCorp and widespread fraud in their clinical trials." As he began to outline the situation, Jonathan caught Sarah's eye. She gave him a small, grateful smile, the first real connection they'd shared in all their years of working together. Outside the hospital room, the bustling city continued its relentless pace. But inside, in that quiet space between life and death, hope and despair, a transformation was taking place. Jonathan Blackwell, once the epitome of corporate greed, was choosing a different path, one of redemption, sacrifice, and the courage to stand up for what's right no matter the cost. The choice had been made. Now they would face the consequences together. The New York City courthouse steps were a sea of flashing cameras and shouting reporters. At the center of the media frenzy stood Jonathan Blackwell, his once impeccable suit now rumpled from days of testimony and sleepless nights. "Mr. Blackwell, is it true you're facing federal charges? What do you say to accusations that you're trying to save face? How do you respond to PharmaCorp's denial of any wrongdoing?" The questions came rapid fire, a cacophony of doubt and suspicion. Jonathan raised his hands, silencing the crowd. "I stand by every word of my testimony," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. "PharmaCorp knowingly falsified data, putting countless lives at risk. I only regret not coming forward sooner." As he spoke, his eyes found Sarah Thompson in the crowd. She stood off to the side, away from the cameras Tommy held close to her side. The boy looked pale but alert, his eyes wide as he took in the scene. "My actions may have cost me my career, my reputation, and possibly my freedom," Jonathan continued. "But if it means saving even one life, like that of young Tommy Thompson, then it's a price I'm willing to pay." The mention of Tommy's name sent a fresh wave of questions through the crowd. Jonathan ignored them, making his way down the steps to where Sarah and Tommy waited. "How are you holding up?" he asked softly, kneeling down to Tommy's level. The boy gave a weak smile. "The doctors say I'm doing better. Mom says it's because of you." Jonathan felt a lump form in his throat. "Your mom's the real hero here, buddy. I'm just trying to make things right." Sarah placed a hand on Jonathan's shoulder. "We can't thank you enough for what you've done. The new treatment, it's giving Tommy a real chance." Before Jonathan could respond, his lawyer appeared at his side. "We need to go," she said urgently. "The U.S. attorney wants to meet." Jonathan nodded, standing slowly. "I have to go," he told Sarah and Tommy. "But I'll be in touch. Whatever happens, I promise you won't have to face this alone." As he turned to leave, Tommy's small voice stopped him. "Mr. Blackwell? Mom says you might have to go away for a while, is that true?" Jonathan knelt down again, looking Tommy in the eye. "I might, buddy, but sometimes doing the right thing comes with a cost. What matters is that you're getting better." Tommy's brow furrowed in thought. Then, with a solemnity beyond his years, he said, "I hope they don't send you away. But if they do, I'll write you letters, okay?" The simple offer, so full of innocence and gratitude, nearly broke Jonathan. He managed a nod, not trusting his voice. As he walked away, flanked by his legal team, Jonathan could feel the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. His future was unclear, fraught with legal battles and potential imprisonment. The empire he'd built was crumbling, his former allies now turned accusers. Yet strangely, he felt lighter than he had in years. The burden of complicity, of turning a blind eye to suffering for the sake of profit, had been lifted. In its place was a sense of purpose, a clarity of conscience that no amount of wealth or power could provide. Later that evening, as Jonathan sat in his now empty office, boxing up the last of his personal items, he received a text from Sarah. It was a photo of Tommy, smiling weakly but genuinely from his hospital bed, giving a thumbs up. The caption read, "First day of new treatment. Thank you for giving us hope." Jonathan stared at the image, tears blurring his vision. This was why he'd done it. This was the true measure of success, not in dollars and cents, but in lives touched and hope restored. As he placed the last of his awards and accolades into a box, Jonathan realized he no longer cared about the trappings of his former life. The sacrifice he'd made, his career, his reputation, possibly his freedom, paled in comparison to the gift of a second chance for Tommy and countless others like him. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with legal battles and public scrutiny. But as Jonathan Blackwell looked out at the New York skyline one last time from his corner office, he knew he'd made the right choice. He had sacrificed everything he once thought important, only to gain something far more valuable: redemption, purpose, and the knowledge that he had finally, truly made a difference. The sun was setting on his old life, but in that golden light, Jonathan saw the promise of a new dawn. A dawn where profits didn't trump people, where corporations were held accountable, and where one man's sacrifice could spark a movement for change. As he turned off the lights and closed the door behind him, Jonathan Blackwell stepped into an uncertain future. But for the first time in his life, he was truly at peace. 5 years later, the warm June sun bathed Central Park in a golden glow as families gathered for the annual Hope for Tomorrow charity picnic. Amid the laughter and chatter, a tall figure made his way through the crowd, drawing curious glances and whispered conversations. Jonathan Blackwell, his hair now streaked with gray and his designer suits replaced by simple jeans and a polo shirt, moved with purpose towards a colorful banner. Beneath it stood Sarah Thompson, directing volunteers with the ease of someone who had found her calling. "Sarah," Jonathan called out, a smile breaking across his weathered face. She turned, her eyes lighting up with recognition. "Jonathan, you made it!" Sarah rushed over, enveloping him in a warm hug. "We weren't sure if they'd let me out for the day." Jonathan finished with a wry chuckle. Good behavior goes a long way, even in federal prison. The years had been hard, but not without purpose. Jonathan's testimony had blown the lid off not just PharmaCorp's misdeeds, but a web of corruption that ran through much of the pharmaceutical industry. The ensuing investigations and reforms had saved countless lives, though at great personal cost. "How's Tommy?" Jonathan asked, his voice softening. Sarah's eyes misted over. "Why don't you ask him yourself?" As if on cue, a lanky teenager with a mop of curly hair bounded up to them. "Mr. Blackwell, Mom said you might come, but I didn't want to get my hopes up." Jonathan stared in amazement. The sickly boy he remembered had been replaced by a vibrant young man, his cheeks flushed with health and excitement. "Tommy? I can't believe it." "Look at you." Tommy grinned, pulling Jonathan into a bear hug. "All thanks to you, sir. The doctors say I'm completely cancer-free now." As they talked, catching up on years of missed moments, a small crowd began to gather. Many were families whose lives had been touched by the PharmaCorp scandal and the subsequent reforms. They approached cautiously, some with tears in their eyes, others with hands outstretched in gratitude. "Mr. Blackwell," a woman said softly, her voice choked with emotion. "My daughter was in the same trial as Tommy. Because of you, we found out in time to switch her treatment. You saved her life." One by one, people came forward with their stories. Lives saved, families kept whole, all because one man had chosen to speak out. Jonathan listened to each one, his heart swelling with a mix of joy and sorrow. The weight of his choices, both past and present, hung heavy, but the evidence of lives changed gave him strength. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, Sarah took the stage to address the gathered crowd. 5 years ago, many of us were fighting battles we thought we couldn't win, against disease, against a system that seemed rigged against us. But then one man stood up and said, "Enough." She paused, her eyes finding Jonathan in the crowd. Jonathan Blackwell sacrificed everything, his career, his freedom, to expose the truth and give hope to families like mine. Today we're not just celebrating our survivors. We're celebrating the power of one person to make a difference, to choose what's right over what's easy. A thunderous applause erupted. Jonathan felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Tommy, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you," the boy whispered, "for everything." As the evening wore on, Jonathan found a quiet moment to reflect. The path he'd chosen had cost him dearly. His wealth was gone, his reputation forever tarnished in some circles. He still had years left on his sentence, days of confinement stretching ahead. But looking out at the sea of faces, lives touched, families healed, a community brought together, he knew he'd make the same choice again in a heartbeat. The man he'd been, obsessed with power and profit, seemed like a stranger now. Sarah joined him, handing him a glass of lemonade. "Penny for your thoughts?" Jonathan smiled, a genuine warmth reaching his eyes. "I was just thinking, all those years chasing success, and I never knew what it really meant until now." As the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Jonathan Blackwell stood surrounded by the true fruits of his labor. Not in gleaming skyscrapers or bulging bank accounts, but in the laughter of children given a second chance, in the tears of parents whose prayers had been answered, in the strength of a community united by hope. He had lost a fortune but gained something far more precious: redemption, purpose, and the knowledge that one person, choosing courage over comfort, really could change the world. As he prepared to return to the confines of his cell, Jonathan carried with him the light of this day, the faces of those he'd helped, the warmth of Tommy's embrace. The road ahead was still long, the consequences of his past still unfolding. But for the first time in years, Jonathan Blackwell looked to the future not with dread but with hope. For in the end, it wasn't the fall from grace that defined him, but the climb back to something far greater, a life of meaning, of impact, of love. And that, he realized, was the greatest success story of all.
So, if you haven't subscribed yet, click the subscribe button below and join our community. Based on your interests, we've picked this story for you that's showing on your screen right now. Click to watch it now. We're sure you'll love it. See you next time.